All right, hello, computer science enthusiasts. Today I want to walk you through what a for loop would look like. I'm just going to walk you through this really simple for loop and show you how it moves the robot. So here we have some code. This is in JavaScript. So if you pulled the blocks out and changed it to text, this is what it would look like in text. And I'm just going to stick with the text for today. So a for loop is a way of repeating some code a certain number of times, and the amount of times a for loop runs is governed on all this stuff that's right in here inside the parentheses after the word for. So let me explain what each part of this is. First of all, var I equals 0, that's an initialization of the variable I and setting that value to I equals 0. Every for loop usually has some indexing variable that they will use. The most common variable people choose is the letter I for index, and the most common place to start is 0. You don't have to start at 0. There might be a time where you want to start your loop at a different number, but for purposes of just repetition, I always start at 0. Then the middle part is a conditional that we're going to check each time the loop runs. If the conditional is true, then we're going to execute the code inside the loop. If the condition is false, then we are not going to execute what's inside the loop. We're done with the loop. We move on to the next statement in the code. And then finally, we've got this incrementer. And so I++ is kind of shorthand notation, and it means let's increment the variable I by one amount. So like if you're counting, if you're at 3 and you increment by 1, you go to 4. So basically we're just adding 1 to the variable I. This is done after you check to see if the code is executed. And if the code is executed, you execute the code and then increment. So we have an initialization that's done once, and then we don't ever reinitialize again. This is just the first step of the loop. This is the thing that we check for over and over and over at each iteration. And then if this is true, we do this after we've executed the code inside. All right, so let's see how that will work. I'm going to do what's called a hand trace, and then I'm going to show you over here on this grid how it affects the robot. So for var I equals 0 is our initialization. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize this variable I to 0. So we'll just put a 0 right there. I is now having a value of 0. Then I check the condition. Is 0 less than 3? That's a true statement. So since 0 is less than 3, I must execute the code inside the braces. If this were a block, it would be inside the block. Robot x is equal to robot x.1. Well, here's robot at robot x, the x coordinate of the robot. If I add 1 to that coordinate and then reassign it back, graphically what's going to happen is I am going to move this robot over 1 square in our grid. Having some issues here. So if I move it over 1 square in the grid, it gets to right there. So that was the first iteration of this loop, or the first time that we executed this loop. Remember, after you execute the loop, then you have to do this part. So I++ just simply means we change the value from 0 to 1. Now I holds a value of 1. Now we go back and we check the conditional in the center. Is 1 less than 3? Still a true statement. Since 1 is less than 3 and that's a true statement, I'm going to execute the robot.x equal robot.x plus 1. So in our program, what would happen is this robot would move over 1. And that's the execution of that line of code. Okay, now that the robot has moved over 1 and I've completed the code, I now go to the incrementer. And the incrementer says, hey, I need to do I++ again. That's going to change that 1 to a 2. And so now I'm back to where I check the conditional. So basically I'm just creating a pattern of check the conditional, do the code, increment. Check the conditional, do the code, increment. It kind of forms this strange triangle that you check over and over and over again until you get a false here. And then once you get a false here, you're done and you just pop right out. All right, so let's check the conditional. I is at 2. 2 less than 3 is a true statement. So I will now go inside and I will increment this code. So to increment this code, that means I go over here and I move the robot one more space again on the x-axis. So now the robot's sitting in that square of the grid. I go back, since I've executed the code, I now need to increment. So I'm going to change that to a 3. Now here's where it gets interesting. So I is now 3. When I check the conditional, 3 less than 3 is false. 3 is not less than 3, it's equal to 3. So since that's a false statement, what that does is it says, I'm done with all the code that's inside the braces. I'm done with all of this stuff. And then I would go back in my program and I would start executing lines in my program after that loop was over. So the loop is finished. So what was interesting about tracing this? Well, you notice that if you set it from 0 to I less than 3, this loop runs 3 times. If I had gone 0, I less than 12, this loop would run 12 times. So if I want to move the robot in the X position a certain number of times, I can put it in a loop that will make it do that. And that's a lot easier than typing out robot.x equals robot.x plus 1 7 times to get him to execute that code. So hopefully you've seen the advantage of using a loop, and this kind of makes the for loop make a little bit more sense to you guys. And so until next time, I want you to keep on coding and keep on creating.